Hi guys, welcome to another episode of Android Programming. In this session, you're going to be learning how to use the Smartlock to provide your users with a simple onboarding process. You'll be learning how to add a Smartlock capability to your app. You're going to manage user credentials using the CRUD implementation, create, read, update, and delete. And you're going to get the best use credentials to delight your users. Firstly, you need to add the Play Services Authentication dependency in the Gradle file, and also add some code to actually save to credential, call from credential, and so on. We're actually going to be covering all these in this tutorial. Right then, Android Studio, I will implore you to use Android Studio 3.0 upward for better performance. In the build Gradle, the model app session, rather than the dependencies, you need to add the GMS Play Services auth. That's for the authentication. This is the library that will actually help with the Smartlock credentials. Once you have that set up, you need a support design as well. Probably if you want to use the recycler view, you want to use some UI functionality in Android, the coordinator layout, and so on. You sync Gradle and set your application ready. I'll be going through the layout files. I have the activity main, which is the launcher, where we are going to have a frame layout that you could actually replace fragments. We'll be replacing the sign-in and the splash fragment on this frame layout with an ID fragment container. We'll be having the fragment for the sign-in, as I've said, since we're going to be replacing the fragment. This is actually for the sign-in purpose, where we have the username and password wrapped around the relative layouts with the clear button and the sign-in button. We could see, and the edit text for the text input layout, that's for the username. We have for the password, which is actually sitting below the username text input layout. And we have two buttons. The first is to clear, probably after you might have signed, or if you probably made a mistake while typing, you could clear out the two fields. And the second button is going to trigger the sign-in, where you get to authenticate your credentials. Lastly, right there in the fragment sign-in XML, you have the progress bar where you set the horizontal to be true, and it sits right below the password text input layout. So this is actually going to show up in the process of authentication. Cool. Let's move further quickly. We have the fragment splash. This is just like a welcome screen. We all know what a splash screen is. Cool. And the content, the activity content, it will serve as like a detail page where you could have your sign out, where you could have more detail of your application, the process of let's call it the home page. You could change credentials and you could sign out. That's the two buttons that are actually visible on this layout. And for the change credentials, since you're going to do an input and output in your username and password, actually I'm going to be coding the username and password, but when you are actually dealing with a real life application, probably for production, you need to actually handle that. You might actually be signing in with the SQLite database, or you might be using the cloud service. Probably you have a web service and API that will actually be saving these credentials too. So you could actually use different HTTP library. You could use the retrofit. You could use Volley. You could also use the HTTP URL connection to actually achieve that. Cool. But that's not the main focus for this tutorial. We actually want to integrate the Smartlock credential. After said and done, we find we could be heading straight to the Java classes, and in the Java classes we just have the replica of the layout we had. We have the main activity, the sign-in fragment, the splash fragment, the username and password class, the content activity, which is actually for like the data page, and we have the code lab utility that's like a boilerplate to actually help us to verify and do some aspects. That's a helper class, and the change credential activity to actually implement the CRUD flow on the username and password. I'll be looking at the sign-in fragment firstly. Since that's going to be the first, the splash rather, we're going to actually start from the splash. The splash fragment just takes the fragment splash, and we have that set up. We will be replacing this fragment in the main activity. We'll get to look at how it's been done, and we have the sign-in fragment as well. That's actually going to take in the edit text input of the username and password, and it's actually going to sign you in. Before I go deeper into sign-in fragments, I'll look at this username and password, which we had said we had coded. The username 123 and the password 123. So it's hard coded. So it's actually going to check for this if they're okay before you could move further. So that's just what that depicts. So right there in the sign-in fragment, we should know what we're expecting at this point in time. This extends fragments, and we have to call out the fields needed: the text input layout, the edit text, the password text input layouts, the edit text for the password as well, the sign-in button, and the progress bar. We actually have the view right there in the fragment sign-in XML, which is being inflated right there in the onCreate view. We should know how to inflate the layout in the fragment instead of using the onCreate, which we are known for in the activity. You use the onCreate view for a fragment. This is where you initialize the view and get them usable. Now for the username edit text, you add a text change listener, which instantiates the text watcher, calling that, and you have to override the before text change and on text change, where you could trigger the validate username layout method. Get to look at that. The same thing goes for password. You trigger the validate password layout. Those are the two methods that takes in the character sequence. Now for the sign in button, what's going to happen? You set an on-click listener to it, and you override the on-click method. This is where you extract the username text and the password. You pass them to a string variable, which you have here, and you initiate the save valid credential. I won't validate password. Let's look at the validation before we actually move further. For validating the username layout, which is actually passed right there when you get the username, this is actually going to call the code lab util. We have that as a helper method or helper class, where you could actually test for the valid username and the valid password. Since we have that coded, so if it's valid, it's actually going to check if the username is equals to username 1, 2, or 3. If not, it's actually going to say probably this is not going to match, so it's not going to allow the login. The same thing goes for the password. So if the password too is not 1, 2, or 3, we have that set up. So cool. We could still move ahead from what we have. So we've covered the validate username layout and the validate password layout methods. Cool. And now we're still right there in the initiation of the valid credential. We need to save the credential. Once you are through with the validation, we need to actually extract the values of the username and password and save it right there using the credential class. Look at it over here. You instantiate it and set up a builder that takes in a username and also sets a password. So you build that up. Cool. And if the code lab util, that's an utility class, is valid credential, you check up the credential. That's going to trigger the save credential, which actually passing the credential as a parameter. Now let's look at the save credential. Where we do? Cool. The save credential. Copy. Control find the. Have it somewhere up there. Cool. We'll get to look at that right there in the main activity. So it's have this credential saved, and we have that rolling. Now let's get to look at the main activity. We've talked about the sign-in. We've talked about the splash fragment. We've talked about the username and password. Now the main activity, where the integration of the sign-in fragment of the splash fragment is actually going to take place. This implements the Google API client connection callback, and also the Google API client connection field listener. And you have to override a couple of methods once you implement the Google API client classes. And you also need the private Google API client and object from this class. Very important. We'll get to look at how you're going to do this in authentication. If you've been using the API client to authenticate, to get the places API, to get the location API, and so on, you know how to actually manipulate the Google API client and actually call the builder, build up the if you should notice, we are calling the credentials API. If you're working with Google APIs, probably you want to log in, you want to check for books, you want to do a lot of things. You're going to actually walk through the Google API client, and this is being instantiated in the onCreate method, where you have to save the valid credentials, which is the credentials API. You build that up and you get the Google API client objects working. The set fragment, that's where we get an intent that actually called the main activity. So to actually set the fragments, and this is done in the runnable or in the handler, which will actually run at the background. And what is the delay in milliseconds? It's actually going to be a 3000 milliseconds, which is like 3 seconds. That's just the delay. That is the intent that actually launch the main activity will take. And what's the intent that is going to launch the main activity is either the splash. You have to set that in the set fragment. Can you see that? You call, since the intent category is the launcher, once it's a launcher, it's going to actually call the splash fragment at first, and the 3 seconds will be applicable to the fragment before it replaces to the sign-in fragment. That's just the gimmick. That's how it works. Look at the replace here. It's going to replace the fragment container, and you have the sign-in and the splash intermittently, giving room for each other. So you have that set up. In the go to content, you start the content activity, and you finish this when you're calling the content activity details. That's when you actually been able to sign in successfully. We have the sign in enabled. We have the get current fragment tag. This actually set the fragment to null if no fragment is set. Cool. You check if the splash fragment is the current selected fragment. So this is on splash fragment. If it's actually the selected fragment, you could use on resolving and on requesting. These are the methods that will be overridden. The onCreate method, the onConnected rather, the onConnection suspended, and the onConnection failed. In the onConnected, that's when you request the credentials. Look at that. Let's get to find the method. Request credentials. Cool. I'll get to find it. Look at that. That's where you request a saved credentials at the unconnected to the Google API client, and this is where you actually check if you've successfully read the credential without any user interaction. That means that there was only a single credential and the user has auto sign-in enabled for this. And we have for another else statement, which is most likely the case where the user has multiple saved credentials and you need to actually pick one. A dialog is actually going to show up, and you could select probably the user have signed in with username 1 before, and now you've actually saved that to credentials, and you're also signing with username 2. You've saved that to credentials. So once you are trying to sign in again, the user will be showed that to credentials, so you have to select one. And for the last case, which is the sign-in required, we have for the resolution required, we have for the sign-in required. This is most likely the case where the user does not currently have any saved credentials and needs to provide the username and password. That's a new user. So you have that right there when you are requesting the credential, and you get that done in the onConnected method. Cool. Let's move ahead. You can request the saved credential, whereby you call the code lab utility to check the valid credential, if the credential is valid. If it is, it goes straight to the content that is actually going to usher you down to the content activity. But if it's not, this is likely due to the credential being changed outside of Smartlock, probably away from Android or Chrome. The credential should be deleted and the user will be allowed to enter a valid credential one more time. So it's actually going to trigger the delete credential method before it requests the credential, before the set sign in enable will be false. So the delete credential method is going to assist you to do that, probably if you've actually not set up or something has really happened and the credential has changed. So cool. We have all these set up right there, and even in the content of activity, we still need to do some things, which is actually going to be ushered after you might have signed in successfully and your credentials has been authenticated. And in the content activity, this extends our compact activity where it implements the connection callback and on connection fade listener. Cool. The same thing. You need the Google API client to call the add API, the authentication credentials API. You build that up when you're calling the logout button. So you need to actually disable auto signing on sign out, because once you sign out, you've been automatically signed in based on your credential. So for you to actually get this off, you need to actually disable this feature. So you're actually going to be calling that rather than when the log out button is being triggered. When you set an on-click listener and you override the on-click method of the logout button, it's actually going to call disable auto sign-in. So you don't have an automatic sign-in when you log out from the application, passing the Google API client object as its parameter. So cool, we have that also done. When you're trying to change credentials, probably you want to actually start up the credentials. You want to change the username password to something different. This is actually going to trigger the change credential activity class, and you get the done there, and you have that successfully done. We could actually look at the change credential activity and see how the flow is. In the create method, we try to initialize the fields, the text, username, password, 1, 2, 3 of username, password. You get the text, and it could be changed by what you are actually passing in when you actually set the on-click listener to the save button, and this time it's actually going to change the credential based on what you're passing in into the edit text field, since it's just you're just trying to change the edit text. You're not actually saving to the SQLite database, but you're not saving those credentials to the cloud, so it's just an edit text manipulation, and you have that set up so the credentials updated outside the Smartlock. So Smartlock is quite cool, and it's one of the latest and let's say industry standard way of actually maintaining a smooth session when the users are trying to sign up and trying to log in into your application. It's actually very, very efficient, and it works in multiple devices. It's not actually limited to probably a particular device. When you're using other devices, it's actually going to call the possibility, the possible sign out. So it's just cool. Probably once you uninstall or your users uninstall an app and they have that installed back in a new device, they don't actually need to go through the process of signing in or actually registering or even signing in. The credentials will pick since it has been saved to the Google API client, and it's actually going to be called from the credentials of the user. So that's just how it flows. And I'll employ you to integrate the Smartlock into your application and see it working, see it rolling. Leave any comment below if you're finding any difficulty in doing this. I'll be there to answer any of your query. Right there in the manifest, we only have the content activity and the change credential activity. These are the two activities that were used. The other layouts is our fragments, the signing fragment and splash fragment, which are living on the host, which is the main activity. So cool, which is the launcher. With all said and done, I've actually made justice to this, and I'll implore you to actually check out the source code from the GitHub link I'll be sharing in the description. And also, don't forget to strike on the button, subscribe to my channel, and I'll say have a wonderful time. Bye bye for now.